So, fellow Endless, I had the chance to watch all 10 episodes of Netflix's The Sandman before launch, and I'm here to bring you my thoughts, review, and breakdown of Neil Gaiman's The Sandman. So, first of all, let me just say this will be a bit of a long video as we are going quite in depth, if you couldn't tell already. I also wanted to cater towards everyone as well and do it in 2 parts. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to watch the series in its entirety or who haven't even started, the first part of this video will be a spoiler-free, no spoilers review of the entire season. But then, of course, we are getting into mega spoiler talk, where we don't only talk about very specific things that have happened, but also the way things have been adapted in Netflix's The Sandman and expanded, with some explanations too that you might have had various questions about, talking about the very ending and what that could be setting up. So I do need to stress that this video will be timestamped. You can skip to video chapters if you want to skip the spoiler-free section and go straight to the way things have been adapted from that of The Sandman Volume 1 and 2, perhaps some of the changes. There might be a question or two where you're thinking and wondering certain things, and then of course getting into the ending explained stuff and maybe how this sets up future seasons and whatnot. Feel free to skip to that, but without further delay, let's start the spoiler free talk. But of course, go ahead and like this video if you do go on to enjoy it. I'd really appreciate that. This video is going to take quite a while to put together, so any support is appreciated from fellow Endless out there. So, to begin with, Netflix is The Sandman, and the very first thing I guess I can say, and you're going to see me look over here at a few bullet points, and this is one of my very first bullet points to mention, and there's no other place for me to start by saying overall, I thought that this was a really, truly faithful adaptation of the Sandman comics. Just even as I was watching these 10 episodes leading up to making this video, you can tell that it was handled with very gentle care one would be expected to have when making a Sandman series and adaptation to do justice to that of Neil Gaiman's beloved story. I would say that it's executed with refreshing innovation that doesn't remotely feel invasive on the source material, but, you know, rather instead it feels quite expansive in all the best ways, of which I will get into some specific examples there and how this innovation, if anything, just aided this adaptation to screen. And honestly, after seeing the stories, and maybe you haven't started it yet, but you know about these stories through having read them, so to those particular fans, after seeing Dream a Little Dream of Me, A Hope in Hell, 24-Hour Diner, Men of Good Fortune with Hob Gadling's character, to that of The Sound of Her Wings with Death, all of these were fantastically executed. And yes, I want to stress as well, even when, and these topics have been quite hot topics of discussion, such as even when there are changes that people have noticed, such as due to the rights of John Constantine being circumscribed during the time of this series, and right now technically, due to J.J. Abrams' bad robot productions holding the license to the character, we have Johanna Constantine instead. Or of course how we have Lucifer Morningstar, who is androgynous, played by Gwendoline Christie. And another casting which sparked a fair amount of discourse would be that of Death, played by the fantastic Kirby Howell-Baptiste. I would say that every episode that explores, you know, Volume 1, Preludes and Nocturnes, and every character we see in Volume 2, The Doll's House, as Neil Gaiman said himself, it's all true to the soul of the work, which was very important for them to maintain when making this show, and it is most certainly present in all of the casting. But before we get more into the casting, what about the overall plot of Season 1 of The Sandman? How was it handled and adapted from the comics? Of course, in no spoiler talk for now. So the way the plot unfolds in terms of adapting the issues of The Sandman, to just put it out there straight away, is handled very well. The beginning portion of episodes, especially with what unfolds with Volume 1, Preludes and Nocturnes, of which is very publicly known by now, I'm sure. This is not spoilery to say that the story kicks off with the imprisonment of Dream, Morpheus himself. Episode 1 kicks you off straight away into the series very faithfully and executes it to the very pages. I was a big fan of just, you know, seeing Charles Dance's Roderick Burgess, everything that surrounded the Order of Ancient Mysteries, to then obviously moving on to the subsequent episodes about Dream finding his totems of power. So for me, even if I take my bias aside and just look at like the first 6 episodes, or, you know, with my fandom for the Sandman, the very first 6 episodes very much so feel like an arc of which the season starts off heavily engaging, really strong, with that of the quest Morpheus goes on, all while planting seeds very early on as well for characters such as John Dee in episode 2, with making certain narrative changes that I would say only enrich certain stories without tainting the source material. Those changes, the expansion, the enriching of certain stories compared to what is in this comic book right here, I will detail more in that spoiler section. The plot to the mid to late part of the season then heavily takes on Rose Walker's story, and where it feels like compared to the beginning 6 episodes, the perspective of focus on characters somewhat shifts. Not that Dream isn't a main or the main character at all, but as per what story follows Rose Walker's, without spoilers, the journey that entails after having initially watched the very gripping episodes of Dream's quest up until episode 6, then shifts focus on a new chapter with volume 2, The Doll's House, and Dream's monitoring of Rose Walker, so to speak, and everything that comes with that. Now, I think for me, by far, my favorite episodes of The Sandman Season 1 are the very first 6. But that doesn't remotely take away from how much fantastic Sandman is still incorporated and adapted into those final 4 episodes as you branch closer into the popular moments from the comics, such as the cereal convention, Lyta and Hector Hall and what's going on with them, and just the overall Doll's House graphic novel side of things. And I need to assure you that even though there may be various naysayers, I mean, each to their own, I suppose, with regards to pointing out that some of these casting decisions are a bad call or whatever, from my perspective, I'm here to assure you that they're not. And I'll tell you why, because the stories that unfold with Lucifer, Death, Constantine, you name it, is still crazy faithful in so many ways that it's quite surprising how many scenes that are just mirrored from these pages of the comics and just the soul and essence of what makes up those issues of the Sandman. Which then leads me to the cast and talking about specific characters. And I can't start at any other place than Dream, Morpheus, the King of Dreams, ruler of the Nightmare Realm. And I have a bit to say about him. So let's just start at, I can honestly say that they cast Dream perfectly. And I always knew he had it about him from when I was making breakdown videos on the casting of Tom Sturridge playing Dream freaking ages ago now. But now having seen him, it's truly very hard for me to imagine anyone else as Morpheus. The way that Tom Sturridge carries himself in the role of Dream is very faithful to the character. I've got a feeling that some places may, say, oh, Dream is too one-note or one-dimensional throughout the show, and it's just like that's how he kind of is. That's the point. There's very subtle aspects of Dream that you get to see shift throughout the series. And honestly, the way that Tom Sturridge pulls off this demeanor of Dream, he does it so very well. His voice is so somber and chilling that if you were to try and recreate it yourself, it comes off as like a very hard sell to replicate that of Dream's cadence. But Tom Sturridge just nails it. Again, the voice may kind of come across as, dull to some people with the kind of soft and, the very careful words that he chooses and speaks with like that. There's little grains of, when he makes subtle changes in expression, it makes it that much more impactful. But again, it is very, authentic to the character of Dream. And the aspect of, I guess you could say, introspection within that of Dream is handled very well in this first season, from his imprisonment for a century under Roderick Burgess, the way he views humanity and the avenues he goes down there to somewhat have a slight perspective change every now and again, to just his overall worldview and how cold he may seem at times. And you all know what I mean about Dream / Morpheus when I mean how he can be a bit of a douchebag at points. But even when he's at his coldest, if you will, in the series, or seemingly so, there's also this tremendous sincerity to Dream that only expands as the episodes unfold, showing each stepping stone Dream takes to have a little bit of a self-evaluation there. As we know about Dream, he's a very kind of bull-headed, stubborn-esque character, very self-important, as especially viewed by his siblings, even dislikable at times with his sense of responsibility as Dream of the Endless and his function. But that's what makes the character so fascinating to watch, a character who's been alive for eons and eons and eons, having this somewhat introspective growth ever so subtly that you witness throughout his journey. Sometimes this is told of different stories in different realms, also in different time periods, seeing different times of Dream and whatnot, and some of the ways they get into that honestly gives me chills, especially with Hob Gadling. Now, as for Dream's big sister, one of the Endless as well, of course, is Death, and I thought that Kirby Howell-Baptiste did a remarkable job in the role. First and foremost as well, episode 6, The Sound of Her Wings, is one of my favorite episodes in the whole season, and she truly shines in, well, technically her episode. I'm sure many readers of the Sandman knows what this gets into in the comics, but in terms of what we were even just talking about with Dream, it fits in nicely here. This time he spends with his big sister also helps Dream understand, a bit more about humans / humanity, the differences between himself and that of his other endless sister, Death, how she has somewhat had her own change from that of the beginning of time until now. And here's the thing, this show had an extremely in-depth casting process, and naysayers aside, with regards to the castings that you may have heard various people disagree with, I truly do feel as though when I was watching Death on screen, Kirby Howell-Baptiste plays the character to that of what is embodied on the page. She is a Death that is very kind, endearing, compassionate, cheeky, and it just made me smile throughout the whole episode with her interactions with Dream. The Sound of Her Wings, episode 6, is very faithful to the comics. It also incorporates a short story that Neil Gaiman had written called Winter's Tale. And the same goes for Lucifer. Other castings like Gwendoline Christie, she did a fantastic job as well. She really embodies Lucifer. She came across as very imposing, sometimes held back, but with the ability to never let you forget that she could become a danger at any moment. Truly the ruler of hell. And oh man, I wish some people weren't so face value that's not Lucifer or whatever. She is so well casted as Lucifer, in my opinion. Man, A Hope in Hell was a really interesting episode with some interesting changes as well, of which we're going to get into in the back half of this video. Boyd Holbrook as the Corinthian is another example of definitive casting. He pulls off the nightmare that is the Corinthian so well. For a man who has inspired many serial killers, or not really a man, but a nightmare, he walks around in this role as if it was always modeled for him. Now, David Thewlis as John Dee, aka Dr. Destiny, was a very welcome addition to the cast for me, of which, offered aside to Dr. Destiny, the Sandman comic just quite simply didn't. The extra narrative that they somewhat give to John Dee and Dr. Destiny in Netflix's The Sandman allows the character to be even more interesting, with David Thewlis doing a fantastic job with the extra depth that character is given. Jenna Coleman as Johanna Constantine, I think, is going to surprise people. Again, it's another topic of conversation amongst various fans, but they couldn't even use John Constantine if they wanted to, because of what I mentioned earlier with how the license is with J.J. Abrams on the Warner Brothers Discovery, and they're meant to be making an HBO Max series with that, but who knows what's going to happen with that. But even so, Jenna Coleman pulls off a somewhat modern Constantine that is suited to this series so well. She has these sleazy mannerisms, the humor and charisma that you would expect from Constantine, and it's also like a subtle change of clientele as well of what was already teased from Neil Gaiman and Jenna Coleman, which was interesting to see. You also get a peek into her haunting backstory, of which many people are familiar with. And even though I was down to see Jenna Coleman as Constantine, my expectations were exceeded. Patton Oswalt is fantastic as Matthew the Raven. I really enjoyed Matthew. The reluctance of Dream, getting to kind of know him, but yet Matthew's loyalty and his jokes just being fantastic. I can't wait for everyone to see that. Ferdinand Kingsley as Hob Gadling features in episode 6. Literally, as I keep mentioning, one of my favorites. His back and forth with Dream was perfect, and I can't wait for new fans of the series to see that somewhat men of good fortune short tale. And honestly, I could go on forever about the casting, but I've got too much to talk about forever with other things. But honestly, Charles Dance's Roderick Burgess, Asim Chowdhury and Sanjeev Bhaskara's Cain and Abel, to that of Mark Hamill's Mervyn, Pumpkinhead, Hal, Rose Walker, Lyta and Hector Hall, and I'm probably forgetting so many. Lucian, it's really good. If you couldn't tell already, I completely agree with the casting director. Now, the production and atmosphere of this show, I would say, is really, really decent. Like, it's got so many locations that have really awe-striking shots, like hell, the dreaming. They put a lot of effort into many, many places. As Neil Gaiman said himself, that the comics were always the Bible. Even at times when doing a shot, they would have the comic handy and just be like, okay, can we replicate this shot? Or if it can't be in terms of a translation to TV, that's when they might somewhat change it up. But you'll be surprised at how many shots they do replicate. And despite how much I think various locations are beautiful and how some are more polished than others, that's a thing sometimes. I would say that in some shots, you can tell that there's some green screen going on there. I would say various shots, without getting into spoilers, such as the dreaming, this won't be a big problem for that of, I would say, like the casual watcher, and it's not ridiculously distracting. It's just some shots and some locations at times look way better than other moments. This doesn't take away from the quality massively for me. There's still so many set pieces that are incredible. The props, the costumes, the design is all still there. It's just when I think the Sandman is dealing with entering the dreaming and these various other locations from that of the waking world side of things, it can somewhat contrast it a bit. And maybe contrast is being a bit too hard with the word, but you'll see what I mean with the way it kind of does shift, with sometimes that of noticeable green screening than other moments. Now, as for tone, I'm very happy that it doesn't really hold back. It is TVMA, so it is indeed for mature audiences. And if you know anything about the 24-hour diner episode, it does get pretty dark to even other various moments from episode to episode, such as language and what have you. So the maturity rating really allows Netflix to be able to tell the story and bring it to fruition as intended. So overall, guys, like for the non-spoilery wrap-up, it is very faithful, great for old fans and new fans alike. So if you haven't watched it yet, go and watch it. Like, if you're a new fan, I think you'll really enjoy it, especially if you're into this side of things. But even if you're an old fan, I struggle to believe that you won't like it. Like, that will genuinely kind of perplex me a bit. But anyway, we're now entering the spoiler section, because now I can get into how various things were adapted and some specific details of various episodes. So full spoiler warning now. We are now moving on to the spoiler talk, the ending, and things like that. So if you've made it this far, definitely come back once you've seen the episodes, because I'm sure you might have some various questions about how certain things go down, why didn't this happen, or what does that mean with the ending, and everything like that. So looking forward to see you when you've seen all 10 episodes. Now, one thing about Netflix's The Sandman that will be looked to by a lot of existing fans of the series is just how it's adapted. And there is subtle differences in the story that I do truly believe that aided, such as with John Constantine. Little things like, instead of John asking for the nightmares to go away as he does in the comics right before, you know, him and Dream part ways after Dream a Little Dream of Me, and when Dream got his pouch of sand back, in this series, a subtle change would be where Morpheus observes the dream of Johanna and offers it more or less as a reward to help her nightmares go away, instead of John requesting it at the end. Even a subtle change like that allows this somewhat almost compassion that Dream has, which again you don't often see too much. Instead of John asking for a favor in that of issue 3 of the Sandman, here you have something that Dream thinks of helping Johanna out with. But then again, of course, there's moments of when John shouts at Morpheus and how he can't bloody leave Rachel like this, of which here in the series is done in an extremely similar way. It's all largely the same, but then again, there's subtle changes, sometimes larger changes, that ultimately, to me, just these changes that are made didn't feel invasive to me as a fan of the key moments in the first 2 volumes. Or you may have noticed in how we have moments in where certain stories are set up a bit longer compared to that of the issues of the Sandman, because that's one of the translations of that of opening a comic book issue to that of watching an episode of television, so to speak. Because as Neil Gaiman said, the biggest challenge was making something that people would keep watching and wanting to see how it ended and come back for the episode after, spending longer getting to know these people and getting to love them, because that's what makes it matter. That's what makes you willing to spend the rest of the time with them. So a good example of this was making that of Boyd Holbrook's Corinthian quite a bit of an expanded role in terms of like the span of the 10 episodes. We practically see everything happen with the Corinthian as it does in the comics, but in the narrative sense of comic issue to that of TV, the translation, as Neil Gaiman said, had us spend more time with the character, which was honestly a bonus to me, and I'm sure many fans out there, as Boyd Holbrook portrays the character so well. If anything, it gives us more of a deep understanding from that of Dream's nightmare creation, his perspective on his master, and his desire to taste what it's like to be human. Another one would be in the case of that of John Dee's Dr. Destiny, of which, even though there were so many accuracies, there's also a fair bit of expansion here. For example, in the comics, John Dee literally kills poor Rosemary, you know, the Rosemary who drove John to the gas station to where his ruby was stored. But instead, in the series, we have David Thewlis's take on John Dee offer the amulet of protection to Rosemary so that no one can hurt her again, so that she doesn't need to ever be afraid of even lying again. As a result of these changes, there's some sort of kind of empathy that the audience can have with John Dee's character in the way the story is told here, compared to that of like the Ruby's corruption that wasn't meant for mortals in that of Preludes and Nocturnes. Now, obviously, while not being able to remotely condone his actions, don't get me wrong, it's just the scenes of him and Ethel Cripps, his mother, in the psychiatric hospital, what she did in order to keep them both alive, and the way these scenes were explored with David Thewlis. Him talking about how wonderful it was every birthday that, you know, he could grant a dream to come true, snow in July. It was just, there was a beauty to these scenes, despite these characters not being the protagonists, if you will. But in the story of, you know, the 24-hour diner or 24/7, we touch on the somewhat warped humanity John Dee has, but humanity nonetheless, especially again compared to that of what we read in the comic. And I feel as though in Netflix's adaptation, they do achieve a story of a lot more depth versus that of the comics, and where Dr. Destiny is just, you know, in a similar way driving the world insane and going mad, albeit that they're still acting on their inner desires and secrets. He's more or less in the comic a lot more sadistic for his own pleasure, to even of the point of where it was so much fun he didn't want to stop. But with David Thewlis's John Dee, there was a lot more motivation behind his decision to do what he did. Here, he is somewhat motivated by wanting to save the world and reveal mankind's truth, in still a pretty insane, out of touch way, don't get me wrong. But there's a lot more warped justification from John Dee's end behind it than of the journey and motivation Dr. Destiny has in the comic, as I keep comparing. And despite the changes, there's still incredible accuracies in fun scenes. Too many to list, obviously, because then this video will go on for 3 hours. But obviously the manner of deaths in the diner, word for word lines of the kindly ones telling him his future, John being in Dream's hand at the end, returning him to the psychiatric hospital, of which in the comic was Arkham Asylum. To me, with Neil Gaiman being so close to this series, involved in the writing, it all just provides an improved rendition upon the original works from the pages and offering a much more intriguing narrative for the episode in the Netflix series, all while matching literal panels from the comic. And then even with other aspects in this season, certain decisions are likely made to perhaps move along the pace of episodes, taking out moments such as where Morpheus returns to the dreaming quite weak. Although in episode 2 we visit Cain and Abel with Gregory the Gargoyle, in the Netflix series, although Morpheus is very weak and he's like, you know, out cold on the sand, he doesn't get rescued and flown away by Gregory the Gargoyle. Instead, Lucian runs up to Morpheus. Yet at the same time, there are some larger somewhat changes amongst all of this accuracy that takes place in episode 2, for example, in where to get some power back for what lies ahead for Dream and, you know, regaining his totems of power, Dream, oh man, I did want to talk about this, goes on to uncreate Gregory. This was heartbreaking to watch, especially with how freaking adorable Gregory is, wanting to play fetch with the ball. They were making him deliberately cute, so you'd feel so bad for when that moment happened, and ultimately just agreeing himself to help out Lord Morpheus in an effort to restore the dreaming. Honestly, it makes me feel quite sad even speaking about it, but I think this decision was made because it was obviously pretty emotionally impactful. It was right towards the beginning of the series, as soon as Dream escaped his imprisonment back to the dreaming, and it showed that there is this other side and even sympathy to Dream very early on that you don't often, and as I said, it's very few and far between you see moments like this portrayed in his face, how much he cares about his creations and how painful this still was for him, but also how his responsibility to his function of Dream of the Endless and restoring the dreaming is of the utmost importance to him. But out of it still came the adorable Goldie, which is an accuracy in of itself, or Irving, of whom, yeah, just so cute. And then there's other decisions that were made that we briefly touched on before, such as in where, of course, Winter's Tale was merged with The Sound of Her Wings, and how that episode also had Men of Good Fortune, a tale of Hob Gadling, meeting Dream every century in the same pub, all within that of the same episode, which, again, I feel like episode 6 was just a wholesome episode, you know, death and Dream, and then Dream and Hob Gadling, and seeing that ultimately reach a very wholesome last scene in that episode of Dream smiling at Hob Gadling. I absolutely loved this episode. I know I keep saying it, but also, just whilst I think of it, when Dream met up with Hob Gadling again in 1889, you may remember that Dream said that he saw Lady Johanna again after their previous meeting, in where both Hob and Dream met her in 1789. Dream details to Hob Gadling that she undertook a task for me and succeeded admirably, I might add. But the whole reason I'm talking about this is because that whole line was likely an Easter egg for when Dream met her again in 1794, so several years after 1789 when they first met in this series, tasking her to find his son's head named Orpheus. Let's just say that he was previously torn apart with only his head remaining, but he couldn't die, and this story goes on to become something quite else, which is significant in the Sandman's ending. But at the same time, I don't want to give away everything. Lucifer, A Hope in Hell. As I've mentioned, I really enjoyed this episode, and it's a bit different with regards to how they made it kind of cooler, and I'm really okay with this change personally, with Dream actually facing off against Lucifer, whereas in the comics it was actually Corazon of whom Dream had the contest of wits with. As for like the logic of how all this works, it's a bit of like divine god-esque kind of level stuff going on, but it all boils down to where the players of the game take on the role of an identity or a person, animal if you will, or an item, and when what makes up that very thing, you use it to take out your opponent's pick, which ultimately does end in a very, very similar way to that of the comics, in where in this series Lucifer chooses the anti-life, and what could survive that, right? And Dream comes back with hope, of which is the secret weapon, as all that remains if everything could somewhat be destroyed is the hope of that there is a way. Now, regardless of in the comics it being the demon Coronzon who faced off against Dream, Lucifer was still pretty pissed because of the humiliation of the lines that they go on to say in front of all the demons right before Dream departs the realm of hell. But perhaps with more of a motivation in this series, since Lucifer himself was not only humiliated by that moment right before Dream left, but also in the duel, as Lucifer was indeed the opponent here. But I do love the humiliation that was, maintained from the comics, because it is one of the most famous lines of, what power would hell have if those here imprisoned were not able to dream of heaven? And through being outplayed, if you will, and this is why I love Gwendoline Christie in the role of Lucifer Morningstar, the facial expressions that she made as Lucifer were just fantastic. Such a bunch of things going on there of disdain, rage, frustration, intrigue, shock. And there's other things as well, such as the inclusion of Nada in Hell, just as it's featured in the Hope of Hell issue. And that was an intriguing thing for the audience to see, as it's not fully explained what's going on there, especially for new audiences to this series. Other than Dream mentioning to Nada that it's been 10,000 years and she still loves him, and he too, but Morpheus still hasn't forgiven her. Now, if you want to know kind of what's going on there, we're going to get into a little bit of that. And what she did to end up in hell was defying him. Now, nothing more is mentioned in the rest of this season, but essentially in the comics, due to Dream and Nada being lovers, which was obvious enough, we can't forget that it is forbidden for the Endless to have such a relationship with mortals. And as a result, more or less, Nada's city was obliterated by a meteor. And after Nada saw what being with Dream of the Endless caused, she ended up taking her own life. Dream saw this as somewhat of a rejection, and sent her to hell. Now, later on, and I'm sure we will get to this because it is a part of a trip that Morpheus takes back to hell anyway, that should be unfolding in the following story that will hopefully come with future seasons. Death basically has a big go at Morpheus when there's a family dinner, if you will, amongst the Endless. And since obviously Dream looks up to his big sister, his perspective is like, maybe you have a point. And he goes back to hell with the intention of freeing her. And I would really like to see it done in such a way that it would be really cool to see Morpheus, when he returns to hell to do this, that on his return trip, after that family dinner, perhaps we get flashbacks with his time with Nada, before also going on to see Lucifer again too in this moment on this trip to hell to save Lyta, because Lucifer at that time is up to something very interesting with regards to hell. So overall, just mentioning these moments in the story that we saw on Netflix's The Sandman, I feel like with the new picture they had to paint, from adapting it from comic issue to that of unfolding it in an episodic format, they did a great job at intersecting all of these things together whilst being incredibly accurate at the same time. Whether that's from where you even see the scene of where John Constantine in the comics, but yet it's Johanna meeting with Mad Hetty, Dream speaking to the three fates, or the kindly ones, if you will, to find out where his totems of power are. Abel saying more or less word for word, telling a story about two brothers to Goldie, John Dee's car journey with Rosemary, to countless more things that would just be way too long to mention. Now, I assume many potential new viewers to this series might wonder about things like, why didn't any of the Endless help free Dream when he was imprisoned by Roderick Burgess for a century? Well, first of all, if you couldn't already tell with, characters such as Desire, they are quite a dysfunctional family. But you may ask, but what about his big sister Death? Look how close they were. And also, because with Roderick's death in the first episode, another subtle change there I might add, instead of a heart attack, it was a bump on the head, which caused Alex Burgess to take over Dream's imprisonment. Surely Death would have collected Roderick there in that moment and freed her brother, right? Now, Neil Gaiman actually once referenced this with regards to the comics and the story and this implication that this is a huge hole in the plot. But to his mind, Death knew about the Sandman being trapped as soon as it happened. Everyone in his family did. He went on to say that the reason the Endless didn't free him isn't because they weren't aware of the situation, but because they aren't a super team. Rushing to the rescue isn't what they're about. The Endless stick to hoeing their own farms. As a personification of things, they're not causative, that they're barely reactive. And my favorite part of what Neil Gaiman said here, and is really low-key true to Dream, he goes on to say that besides, even if the Endless had acted to break the Sandman out, he probably would have been very angry at them for doing so. He definitely wouldn't have been anything approaching appreciative. And from the episode of The Sound of Her Wings, it more or less goes down the exact same way there as well, and where Dream informs Death that they were trying to summon her, not him, and she just answers, "I know," and changes the subject. There's no like, "Oh, so why didn't you help me?" and stuff like that. Now, another cool way to look at this is you could also interpret the scene before this moment with Death and Dream, and where they were sat at the park bench, and where she says, "You could have called me," you know, as a nod to how Dream could have reached out to her during his imprisonment. And Dream replies, "I didn't want to worry you," which is when Death then replies and yells at him, calling him stupid and self-centered. But also, to what Gaiman said, he's just not really the type to do that. But then let's just talk about how ultimately the events of this season led up to Dream almost killing Rose Walker, the Vortex, of whom is technically a child and relative of the Endless. And that, we can't forget, would have been against the rules and more or less brought down the kindly ones upon Dream and completely, you know, decimated him as they dealt with those who violated like higher plane rules like that. As we know, Endless can't kill mortals unless it's like in the situation of a vortex. That's why Dream was going to do that to Rose Walker. They can't harm or basically kill one of their own kind directly. And this is what Desire was doing, like orchestrating from a long while back, trying to make Dream actually kill one of his own kin, so to speak, because that's what he would have done through killing Rose Walker and would have brought on the wrath of the kindly ones. And let's just say in the comics, it's portrayed quite a lot darker with Unity Kincaid in her long sleep. In this, it's portrayed like, you know, she was dreaming and she fell in love and had a baby with a man with golden eyes. But in the comics, let's just say that Desire went to the lengths of, let's just say that Unity Kincaid did not consent to getting pregnant. Now, with regards to the ending and how, you know, Unity Kincaid sacrificed herself for Rose Walker, in the comics it's somewhat ambiguous as to how Unity knows she was meant to be a vortex, as for most of her life she has just been asleep and then just knew of this knowledge that Dream himself didn't know. And it happened in a very similar way where, you know, she came to Dream saying like, I was meant to be the vortex, but again, like, it's not like thoroughly explained, so some people may be like, oh, you know, that's a bit convenient. In the comics, it's more or less depicted through her connection to the dreaming, and there's a bit of dream logic going on there as to how she just in time says to Morpheus that she was supposed to be the vortex, putting it together logically, I guess, that during him being imprisoned, if he hadn't have been, she would have been obviously the vortex and it wouldn't have been Rose. And I think that's why in the series they added in the scene of her wanting to read her own book in the Library of the Dreaming. And this was set up as well with that phone call from Rose Walker to Unity earlier on in the episode, and where she even said to Rose that she often wonders what life would have been like had she not slept through it. So therefore there is some reason as to when, right after that phone call, Unity falls asleep and then dreams of, you know, what her life would have been like had she not slept. So when she was in the dreaming, she seeked out some knowledge of that. And thus that book gives her the extra context that she needed to save Rose Walker, and so thus it comes across a little bit less contrived from that of what is depicted in the comics, even though I guess it could be argued that she could have still just literally dreamed about anything else, and, you know, so it was a bit convenient that she did dream of it. And then, of course, in this moment, Dream found out that Desire was Rose's great-grandparent, and he confronted Desire at the end, which is more or less where the series ended off, with her promising to draw blood next time, which is more or less, I guess, you know, a setup for their future uneasy relationship between them both. And overall, with the ending, let's get into a few explained aspects here with regards to what can be set up and teased and just break down a few things. So I have no doubt that if we get future seasons, we will see Boyd Holbrook's Corinthian again back to reprise his role. As we see per the comics, Dream teases that when he recreates him, next time I will make you, you will not be so flawed and petty, little Dream. Now, this might not be for a while, so it's going to be interesting to see when they adapt that. Next up is Lyta and Hector Hall. I just realized I've been saying Lyta being the daughter of Wonder Woman and Steve Trevor, and Hector Hall being the son of Hawkman and Hawkgirl. Not so referenced in this series, but regardless, they're baby. Their baby is a very important character. Let's just say he has a very big destiny, and we've already had it teased that Morpheus said one day he will come for the child, so this would definitely be explored in the future. This also reminds me of how the nightmare roles of Brute and Glob, of whom were originally in Morpheus's century absence from the dreaming, had wanted to take over and more or less made their own Sandman, which was originally Hector Hall in the comics. Now, this was changed into Galt's arc, of whom was a nightmare who wanted to become a dream and actually did at the very, very end, which was a nice, full circle story there. Now, she didn't want to seize the control of the dreaming or anything like that, but just help Jed and create good things. She also made Rose Walker's brother Jed the Sandman in his dreams, which was a little bit of a take and nod to Hector Hall in the comics. But with regards to Hector Hall, things more or less went down the same way as they did in the comics, with Hector being sent to the afterlife and Lyta being super upset and pissed, especially when Morpheus said about coming to collect her child one day due to carrying the baby that was conceived in that of the dreaming. He feels like it belongs to him, which is again another thing where we're all just like, Morpheus, please just stop. But as for the actual ending explained with Lucifer, what could be going on there? So after swearing to destroy Dream, of which he also reiterated to Cain in the comics when Cain was sent to hell to announce Dream returning once again, which this time is to save Nada, of which we should and possibly will see in the future as we went over earlier. When Dream got there, Lucifer's promise was fulfilled, but how? And that is that Lucifer wanted to retire from hell and leave. Lucifer even got Dream to assist in chopping off Lucifer's wings, and also wanted to hand the key to hell to Dream. Now, how is this fulfilling the promise to destroy Dream? Well, when Lucifer handed the key to hell to Dream, Lucifer said that I once swore that I would destroy you. Perhaps it will destroy you, and perhaps it won't, but I doubt it will make your life any easier. And so Dream, from there on out, was technically the ruler of hell. Now, in the comics, after Lucifer gave the key to hell to Dream, essentially a bunch of very powerful people from very powerful realms arrived in the dreaming to petition Morpheus for the key, and thus being in rule of hell, and one of them was Azazel. But they could be changing the story a little bit. Azazel says that they've come at the bidding of the assembled lords of hell, with Lucifer replying, you've stopped fighting each other long enough to assemble. You wish to invade the dreaming and perhaps the waking world, and one day even the Silver City, which is, pretty cool to imagine. Either way, though, the generals demand action, and she says you may tell them, good day, your majesty. This is when the big tease comes. Mazikeen of the Lilim asks, what are you going to do? And this is where I think it will still likely stay true to that of the comics, as per a lot of things in the story, just maybe with some innovation there for expansion. Lucifer replies, I'm going to do something that I've never done before. Something that will make God absolutely livid. Loved her expression there, because Lucifer was just imagining God being livid. And lastly saying, and bring Morpheus to his knees. And surely that is leaving hell, because, well, 1, Lucifer's never done that before. 2, God will be pissed. And 3, Morpheus will have to deal with all of the crap in hell, among being met with many people who want to hold the key to hell for their own reign. So just like in the comics, it is in a hope that it will be Morpheus's undoing, or bring him to his knees, still fulfilling the promise that one day we will destroy you. So I do think that is the direction they will head. I can't imagine they're going to vastly change it up and invade the dreaming or anything like that. It will probably follow this story. And I think that more or less wraps up my long, in-depth breakdown of Netflix's The Sandman. Trust me, I could have gone on for even more comparisons and differences in various issues of The Sandman that were adapted to episodes of this season, but I think I've rambled enough now, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you thought of The Sandman. As you can tell, I thoroughly enjoyed this adaptation. I thought it was very faithful, but you've heard me say that enough times, so now I leave the floor to you. What do you think of some of these explanations and comparisons as well? Do you agree with me that, for example, they added a lot more depth to Dr. Destiny in episode 5, or even before that when he was teased, certain characters expansion like the Corinthian being made to, I guess, span the whole season? I can't wait to read everyone's comments and what you thought of The Sandman, but if you got this far in the video, I'd really appreciate a like on it. It took a while to put together, so hopefully you can like it, maybe even share it to get more Endless in here to share their thoughts. Do consider subscribing for more updates on The Sandman, maybe bonus videos. Let me know if you want to see any more bonus videos on The Sandman, other breakdowns and whatnot, and of course news updates for future seasons of The Sandman, and I'm sure you'll like some of the other content that we cover here on this channel. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to love you and leave you now, so thank you so much for watching, especially if you watched this far. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you fellow Endless in the next video. Goodbye.